Jeremy Corbyn, what is Labour's position on renewing Trident now?
The position is that Parliament has voted on Trident. The existing party policy was for renewal. As you very well know, I am not a supporter of nuclear weapons, and we are supporting the UN and its ban process, and Clive Lewis will be continuing the defence review.
Yesterday, though, Clive Lewis, your defence spokesman, said it was settled and that you should stop picking at the scab, to use his phrase. The party's made its decision, hasn't it?
Well, anyone's entitled to raise an opinion on it, and they will. In the future, I'm sure there are many people that are going to become increasingly concerned. I'm not talking about me, I'm not even talking about Labour Party members or members of CND. I'm talking about people in the military and the Treasury are very concerned about the cost of this, and the government hasn't set out its costs on it at all. So I've got a feeling the government's going to be coming back to Parliament with saying there are some problems here about the cost of this.
But you say consistently that you want the party to be more democratic. You want to listen to the party more. The party's made its democratic decision. Do you accept that that is the party policy? Because it sounds like you don't.
Of course I know what the party policy is, and of course I understand the decision that was taken. Does it mean there are people in the party who have a moral objection to nuclear weapons? Yes, there are. But I have to say the party is very united on the idea that we would be a serious participant in the UN legal ban process, which of course takes us beyond the non-proliferation treaty, because it includes those countries that are not members of the system, such as India, Pakistan, Israel and North Korea.
But you sound very determined to bring this issue back to the party.
I want to see a nuclear-free world. I want us to make up our case for that and our participation in that, and that's why Clive will be going to the ban conference.
Given that it is, though, currently the party's policy, despite some attempts to overturn it, do you still stand by what you told us last year, that if you were Prime Minister, you would never use the deterrent?
I never want to use a nuclear weapon.
Let's talk about some other issues. One of the biggest problems around the world at the moment is the situation in Syria. If you were Prime Minister, right now, the UK is bombing so-called IS targets in Syria and Iraq. If you were in number 10, would you continue that?
I would be demanding as quickly as possible a reconvening of the Geneva process, as quickly as possible, getting Russia, America, Syria and the other parties around it. Indeed, I was talking to some Syrian refugees that are here today, here at conference this week rather, in Liverpool, and they all think the only real way forward has to be political solutions. So I think there has to be a reconvening of Geneva very, very quickly.
Diplomats around the world are busting a gut to get talks to happen again. But if you were Prime Minister, Jeremy Corbyn, would you continue UK bombing of so-called Islamic State targets in Iraq and Syria? Because that's happening right now.
And I'm not sure it's working. I'm not sure it's working. I think there has to be a political solution that brings together everybody with the exception of IS to isolate them, and that, I think, has to be the process. Now, we did get a lot of progress in Geneva. There was a ceasefire which tragically broke down last week, and I think questions have got to be asked about the bombing of the UN aid convoys as well as the bombing of civilian targets.
But just to be really clear about this, every world leader, every diplomat believes that talks have to be part of the solution.
But at the same time, they're all bombing.
But right now, the UK is involved in bombing so-called IS targets in Iraq and Syria. Now, you said this week you think there might be an early election, therefore, hypothetically, you might be Prime Minister. If you were Prime Minister soon, would you stop UK bombing of those so-called IS targets in Iraq and Syria or not?
I would ask the effects of it. I would ask who's been killed as a result of it, and ask what the political effects of it. And I would simply say this, as Emily set out in her speech yesterday, there has to be a political solution. I would want to go back to that rather than deepening and extending the military activities, because at the end of the day, there are several million Syrians living in refuge in Lebanon or Jordan or Turkey or Greece or in some parts of Europe, or indeed in Libya also. We have to look at the effects of our policies over the past years, look at what's happened in Afghanistan. Maybe Chilcot should be required reading for a lot of people. Maybe the Select Committee report on Libya should be required reading as well.
But I just want to be really clear on this point, because it sounds like you're saying if you were Prime Minister, you would stop the UK's bombing of IS
What
targets.
it sounds like is, as a Labour Prime Minister, I would bend every muscle I've got to bring about a political settlement and peace, and that would include the non-military options that are so important, because at the end of the day, every war ends by a political settlement. Let's start from it rather than end it.
So you would stop the bombing?
I would look at the effects of that bombing, and I am concerned of the collateral damage that's been done. I'm concerned of the effects of it on civilians in Syria who've got nothing whatsoever to do with ISIL, who are themselves innocent victims of it.
Just forgive me for repeating this point, but if you were Prime Minister, you would have to decide. You would have to tell the RAF, the military, whether or not you wanted them to continue.
I would look at all the evidence and make a decision about how best to bring about the rapidest possible peaceful solution to the situation in Syria, including support for the refugees, including looking at the effects of military action. I said earlier, look at seriously at what Chilcot has said. Look at what the Select Committee said about Libya. Are we bringing about peace by military interventions, or are we actually deepening conflict elsewhere?
But you'd have to decide. Everybody around the world believes that there has to be a political solution. Everybody wants to look at what is best for this very complicated picture. Reviewing things, looking at things are not the same as making a decision.
Well, you make a decision when you've looked at things and reviewed things.
So you won't commit now to doing either?
I would commit to a political solution, a political settlement by non-military means.
One of the other huge issues confronting the country, of course, probably the biggest issue, is how we go about leaving the European Union. For millions of British voters, their decision to leave the European Union was around the issue of immigration. Would you, as Prime Minister, tighten the rules so that fewer EU citizens could come to the UK?
I think we have to look very carefully at this. There are 2 million British people living or working in other parts of Europe. There are European nationals living and working in Britain whose position must be protected. Indeed, Parliament agreed that. And our health service, our care service and many others rely on European nationals. I think the more important issue is the way in which some European workers have been brought here by big companies, particularly in the construction industry, dumped here to work for appalling conditions and low wages. Sport Direct is just one example of undercutting of wages. I want to see the Posting of Workers Directive enforced whilst we're still members of the EU. Post-EU, we've set out our lines for negotiation and communication, which are about market access, but are also about protecting the working conditions that we have across Europe.
But what really matters to many Labour voters who've gone to UKIP, many Labour voters who voted to leave the EU, for many of them that is about immigration and it is about numbers. So again, if you were Prime Minister, would you want to reduce the number of people who were able to come to the UK from the European Union?
What matters to most Labour voters is actually underfunding of schools, underfunding of hospitals, insufficiency of housing, underfunding of local government, and lack of development and jobs in their communities. We set out an economic agenda which is about exports to Europe, is about, yes, of course, imports from Europe, and is about the ability of people to work in different countries. I suspect that when the negotiations get underway, presumably the government has some timetable for this. I don't know what it is, but ours is that we're negotiating and relating now to people across Europe that they may well say the base of this has to be free movement of people. I think at that point you have to make that decision. But the crucial issue is the undercutting of wages. That's what people are so angry about. And look at the wage rates that are paid in different parts of the country. They are very different. But there has to be a degree of equality across the continent.
But many people are worried actually also about the numbers, the way they've seen their communities change.
Well, communities do change, of course, and Andy Burnham has made this point very often. There has to be a return to the Migrant Impact Fund that Gordon Brown set up while he was Prime Minister, which did a great deal to support local government and local services.
But that's a separate issue, Jeremy.
It's not a separate issue, it's a very important issue.
For many people that is a separate principle to whether or not there should be tighter rules so that fewer people can come.
I ask people to think very carefully about this. Tighter rules will also mean it's much more difficult to travel to Europe, much more difficult to take a holiday in Europe, much more difficult to study in Europe, and our universities would be greatly affected by the number of European students.
So what would you actually do about immigration if you were Prime Minister?
What I would do about immigration is try and bring about a degree of coterminosity, a degree of equality on work conditions and wages across Europe, which is why I made such a big emphasis in the referendum campaign, in which 2/3 of Labour voters voted to remain, was for the enforcement of the Posting of Workers Directive to prevent the undercutting of agreed local conditions in this country.
That's what you would do, is focus on
focus on that, and that I think would have an effect on the numbers.
So that would mean the numbers
Indeed,
come
the
down?
numbers vary greatly from country to country, depending on the economic circumstances of the home country.
Do you think that the wider voting public now see you as a potential Prime Minister?
I'm here to lead this party. We are setting out our economic vision and alternative, an economic alternative that does provide decent wages, does fund public services properly, but does crucially invest in an expanding economy, invest which creates the jobs, sustainable jobs for the future. I think that's something that actually is very attractive. Many people are facing a housing crisis. Many people look at their adult children who can't get anywhere to live because they're paying so much in the private rented sector, they can't save for a deposit, and the lack of council housing means if they're eligible for it, they're certainly very unlikely to get it. We have to deal with the stresses and inequalities in Britain. That's what Labour's going to do.
And just finally, it's been an extraordinary year. You've had two enormous successes with the Labour Party expanding the electorate and winning twice. Do you think the last year has changed you?
It's been a very busy year, and I've obviously travelled more than I've ever travelled before around the country, and dealt with a very wide range of issues, and the principles I operate behind it are that I'm put there by people who want to see politics done differently, and I want to make sure that you never get far away from the people that have put you there, which is why I spend so much time travelling around, why I spend a good amount of time representing my constituency, because that is fundamentally what a democracy is about. Those that are in elected office have got to represent the people that put you there. And it's fun, and I enjoy it.
It's fun.
Yes, it's fun. It actually is fun, because you're dealing with fascinating people. I mean, given this morning, for example, I went down to this school here in Liverpool, where the Liverpool Philharmonic are doing orchestras for the kids. Fantastic. A young girl taught me to play the violin. Well, it's only a first lesson, so it's work in progress. I want every child in every school in every part of Britain to have the chance to have and learn a musical instrument. Wouldn't that be great?